Reevesism as an ideology is on life support. And unless things calm down internationally and some miraculous growth happens, I don't see what benefit she is bringing to Keir Starmer anymore. This week on The Division Bell, it's Spring Statement Special. We've got Kemi Badenoch talking about phone use in schools, and we've got Donald Trump's top team embarrassed by big leaks. I'm Christian Calgie.
I'm Lizzy Buchan.
And this is The Division Bell. Obviously, biggest story this week, and probably will roll on for at least another week, if not longer, was yesterday's Spring Statement from Rachel Reeves, or the emergency budget, as the Tories were calling it. Both the Daily Express and the Daily Mirror, very bad headlines for Rachel Reeves, but for different reasons. What was your main reflection on what emerged yesterday?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is not an emergency budget, as much as the Tories want to call it that. The Mirror's been particularly strong today on the cuts to the welfare bill. Obviously, we had last week, we discussed that the Work and Pension Secretary had set out their plans to slash disability benefits and sickness benefits. But yesterday we kind of got the true scale of what that means, and it made for pretty grim reading. The impact assessment that was published alongside showed that 250,000 people will be pushed into poverty by the changes, including 50,000 kids, 3.2 million families affected by the changes. That is not something that our readers want to hear, and it's really difficult for Labour MPs, for trade unions, for people in the Labour movement who want this government to succeed, who support Labour. But I've had quite a few people come to me and just sort of say, cutting disability benefits, this is not a Labour policy. And there was a bit of chaos on Spring Statement Eve as well from the OBR, because it turns out that when we were talking about the welfare cuts last week in last week's episode, we were saying that it was 5 billion worth of cuts. Of course, the OBR then sort of said it's nowhere near, and Rachel Reeves then had to scrabble to find even more cuts and started talking about universal credit as well as PIP. And I think that made things even worse, because the government has, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, they've come out and said, there's a moral case for reforming welfare, and there is an argument to be made for that. Like, getting people back into work is a good thing. The sickness and disability benefits bill is enormous and rising. It is becoming unsustainable, and there's clearly something needs to be done to look at why there's been such an explosion in claims, particularly for personal independence payments. But their moral case for it was undermined by the fact that the night before we start hearing that actually the OBR has found that doesn't agree with the government's figures and actually said you're going to have to find more money. And so Rachel Reeves went back and clawed back another £500 million from universal credit. So it clearly is about, as we've said in the paper, balancing the books.
We've gone in with the front page of the Express calling her reckless Rachel, and I think we've said tanks the economy. Now, that's based on two things. That's based on the growth forecasts, which, as was previously reported was going to happen, have been halved from 2% to 1% this year. And I thought one of the moments that really stood out to me yesterday was when Rachel Reeves was cheering 1.8% growth in the final year of this parliament. Right, so it goes down to 1% this year. Yes, it climbs a bit, bumps along 1.7%, 1.3%, 1.8%. But that is nowhere near the level of growth that Rachel Reeves
needs,
hinted as a promise, or needs in order to achieve basically anything other than austerity light for the next 5 years.
Yeah, there's a question about the kind of how this works as a long-term strategy as well, because in October's budget, figures were set out. She came up with a whole plan, comes back in March for the Spring Statement with a new plan. And a lot of the economists are saying, well, is she going to have to come up again in the autumn?
I think the point you were just making is one of economic stability, we're already talking about what she may have to do next time. And that is because she has given herself very little fiscal headroom.
Oh, jargon buster. Do you want to tell us what that means?
I can have a go. Okay. Basically, it is the difference between all the money the government brings in via taxes and everything it spends. And what the government wants is to have a buffer of a certain amount so that economic instability means that it's not borrowing on a day-to-day basis more than it's bringing in via taxes. And that's one of Rachel Reeves's big economic rules, that she won't spend more than she's bringing in via taxes on a day-to-day basis, and that gives market stability and all the rest. So at the last budget, she gives herself a headroom of £9.9 billion. Now, this is actually really small. It's slightly larger than what Jeremy Hunt left behind, which was, I think, about £6 billion,
which is
really tiny.
Small.
I think it was the smallest ever handed over. So that was, on being fair to Reeves, that was quite a bad inheritance.
A difficult inheritance.
But I think even at the time, people were saying that only putting it to 9.9 billion is not enough, right? We've still got a war in Europe, and we knew Donald Trump was a month and a half away from entering the Oval Office. And that, with all his threats of tariffs, as sure happened, created a load of economic instability, and there were borrowing problems with so-called yields, which is the amount of money it costs to buy government debt. That wiped out the headroom. And then that was what the whole thing about yesterday was restoring that headroom, finding 15 billion quid in savings to take us from 4 billion in a deficit into back to that headroom of nearly 10
because they basically said that what they'd predicted in the autumn was now out, and instead of having that 9.9 billion pounds of sort of extra wiggle room, she suddenly was 4.1 billion pounds in the red. Back in January, Rachel Reeves didn't perhaps know that the PM was going to decide to ramp up defence spending to the timetable that he decided to do, and that Donald Trump would do exactly what he has done. You could argue that somebody somewhere should have been thinking that Donald Trump is not totally unpredictable.
The weird thing is that she's now only restored a £9 billion buffer, and already, as you pointed out from the OBR books, that might be completely wiped out yet again if Donald Trump levies the same tariffs on the UK as he is on Europe. Overnight, we also heard there's going to be 25% tariffs on all cars going from Britain to America, and that's a big industry for us. So some of that headroom already gone. Within 6 hours of Rachel Reeves sitting down after delivering the budget. As I said yesterday, Reevesism as an ideology is on life support. And unless things calm down internationally and some miraculous growth happens, I don't see what benefit she is bringing to Keir Starmer anymore.
A few people have got in touch, letters, and people send me tweets and emails sort of saying, why aren't we considering a wealth tax? Why are the richest not being asked to pay more? And that's a thing that I think is going to keep coming up. Obviously, there's no support in the Treasury for doing that, and it's not a lot of support amongst MPs apart from those on the left. But I think that's going to be increasingly raised in the sort of coming months. I went on a visit with the Chancellor on Monday to a factory in Telford where they're making Boxer vehicles, which are the kind of big armoured vehicles that are going to be used by the British Army. And she was talking there about how she's putting £2.2 billion into defence, and obviously that is really important. Getting our defence spending up to 2.5% may not even be enough anyway. No. But that is a choice, and other things have to suffer for that choice.
The world has changed, and we can see that before our eyes. But we're not a passive government, we're an active government, and we are responding to those changes. We are a strong country. We have brought stability back to our economy, which means that we are able to spend more on defence. We're uplifting that to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. But the first payment into that uplift comes today at the Spring Statement. We're putting an additional £2.2 billion in next year to spending on defence.
prior to the spring statement, we had Prime Minister's questions, and as usual, Kerry Badenoch chose an odd topic. She decided
Another open goal missed.
She decided to talk about phones in schools, which is a very interesting pet subject that the Tories have focused on when it comes to education. So, my question for you: is it the government's responsibility to police mobile phone usage in schools?
I'm going to say no. I think the Tories have really latched onto it because it is popular with parents and it's a good kind of easy issue to get in the newspapers and to get on TV. I think there's a lot of concern from parents about mobile phone usage, about social media. Obviously, a lot of people have been watching Adolescence recently, and kind of there's a lot of conversation around the stuff young people are seeing online. And so I think that is the kind of, obviously that context means it's a good, maybe the Tories think it's a good one to pick up. But I remember it kind of came back and forth under the last government, and all the schools seemed to be saying, we already banned them anyway. Like, do we really need the government bossing us around? Do you really need to legislate for this? There's so many other problems that we are much more worried about.
And there's a problem with the logistics of policing. I mean, how does one teacher prevent 30 pupils in a classroom from going on phones? I mean, firstly, it is utterly terrifying to me that a primary school would need a phone ban in the first place.
True, yeah.
Why the hell are primary school children being given phones? But the argument that Keir Starmer was making at Prime Minister's questions was it's not really, the biggest problem isn't whether children are on their phones, is what they're seeing on their phones. And that was harking back a bit to the adolescence, online extremism. Maybe we're talking about access to hardcore pornography, violence, extremism, all the rest of it. I mean, both are problems. Yes, we've got to deal with what children are seeing. But from my personal view, growing up with a phone, I don't think that's actually possible. I don't think it's possible for parents or authority figures to do that, because kids are always going to be better with technology at circumventing bans. They know how to use VPNs to get round, content blockers that the parents may have set up on the home router. But there is a big issue with attention span, which I think is what Kemi Badenoch was trying to get at, which is whether these kids are, merely checking Snapchat or, I don't know what the kids use these days. I was going to say Facebook, but it definitely isn't Facebook, TikTok. It may not be extremism, but I think, again, to sound like a granddad, there's definitely an element of like brain rot about all of this. And if they're checking their phones, they're getting dings, messages, whatever. Really, they're not concentrating on the lessons. Yeah. But I've got a really strong conviction on this, and I see 7-8-year-olds on the tube or on a bus with their own smartphone. I in my head, I picture those, those portraits of Victorian children smoking. I honestly do. And I think in 20, 30 years, we will look back when the kids are grown up and they all have ADHD and they can't concentrate and they may have been extreme, they may have been subject to extreme political views, pornography, all the rest of it. I think we'll think, why didn't we step in sooner?
Speaking of inappropriate phone use, my favourite story of the week has been the all of these senior members of the Trump administration accidentally inviting a journalist into their top secret Signal chat about military plans.
I mean, it's the dream. It's the equivalent of winning the lottery for us, wouldn't it? It'd be plopping into
incredible
to whatever, Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney's private group chat, WhatsApp group chat. But yes, so the Atlantic editor Jeff Goldberg was put in the planning Signal chat for Yemeni bombing strikes by the US military, and has published this astonishing account of what happened. And he was added by the Defence Secretary accidentally. J.D. Vance was in there. Waltz was in there. I mean, the White House Chief of Staff, security operatives. None of them, there were 16 people in this WhatsApp group, or this group chat, by the way, which is, I would suggest, too many people to be involved in covert planning for a military
Why are they
strike.
doing covert planning on Signal?
I mean, yeah,
They have like encrypted phones or something.
You would
and
think,
an underground
or
bunker.
maybe like
talk
a
about stuff.
meeting in person. But so they're denying that there was any national security element, even though, from what we understand, if these messages got into the wrong hands, they probably would have resulted in the deaths of US servicemen, because you've been able to know where the bombs were coming from.
There's loads of detail as well about the timings of the strikes on the Houthi rebels and stuff like that. I don't know how they can argue that they're not war plans. What a bunch of clowns. There's always a problem in Westminster with like WhatsApp leaks and all that sort of thing. Have you ever had any kind of invited to any secret WhatsApp groups or sent someone the wrong thing?
The one that springs to mind has been quite interesting over the last year, which is that Tom Hunt, who's recently been appointed the Daily Express editor, shares a name with a former Conservative MP, Tom Hunt, spelt exactly the same. And that's been very interesting because obviously the Daily Express has been campaigning quite hard in favour of assisted dying. So Tom Hunt, the Express Tom Hunt's been campaigning for that. Tom Hunt, former MP, has just joined the Right to Life campaign group, which is campaigning against assisted dying. And even though they've got ex-MP Express next to their names on my contacts, I'm frequently texting the wrong person the wrong thing.
Sometimes you have to be so careful. A few years ago, I texted at the time, Conservative minister who shared the same first name as my brother. And me and this minister were supposed to be having coffee, but I was also supposed to be seeing my brother, and I used my brother's nickname in it and then had to frantically delete it when I realised what I'd done. Thanks for watching The Division Bell, and join us again next week. You can follow us on X at Express Politics and at Mirror Politics. Bye for now.